So this morning, I want to talk about WellSpring's great weakness. Okay, and don't get tense or defensive, because I think that WellSpring's great weakness is actually something that we can celebrate and that we don't have to be ashamed of. And I'll tell you just a quick story about my wife and I and how we landed here. We moved to the Spring Hill area and we started doing the thing that you often do sometimes when you move to a new area. You church shop, which I really hate doing that. Some of you may have done that recently. Maybe you're doing that right now and that's what's brought you here. But it's this awkward thing where you go to new places and there's a lot of people that you don't know, and it's just awkward. And we visited a lot of churches in the Brentwood area that, like, from the moment you pulled in to their parking lot, you were just awestruck. You know, they had these beautiful campuses with these massive, beautiful trees and these lush lawns that you would look at and think, how do they get their grass to grow that way? Because my grass in my own lawn doesn't do that. And you go in and the music is just amazing, and everyone who comes on stage is just so attractive, and their pastors would have these, deep, booming voices, and you would just leave thinking, wow, this is incredible. It's amazing. And God bless those churches. There's nothing wrong with them. But for whatever reason, my wife and I just didn't feel like these were the places that God wanted us to be. So we ended up visiting WellSpring. So we came here on a Sunday morning, and there were these oddly painted cinder blocks and this traffic light in the back of the cafeteria, and these murals, of lots of different types of food. And the landscaping here, is a little bit different. I think these plants have possibly been here for the past 9 years or so. And the whole thing, it just felt a little fragile. There was the worship leader at that point. He had this long, scraggly hair, and Andy looks and speaks the way that Andy looks and speaks. And the whole thing was just kind of raw. And it resonated with my wife and I. And we felt like, man, this is a place where we can fit. And I think there's a reason. There's a photo that you can see here. This is me, believe it or not, in elementary school. And I see this picture and I'm instantly filled with like all the weird insecurities of, being a kid. And like I've got this fear and there's this awkwardness, and I feel like maybe I don't quite have what it takes. And I don't know if you're like this, but I see this and I still feel like this kid a lot of times. I still feel like I've got, this weakness and that I'm going to be exposed. And so I think that's some of why WellSpring resonated with us and why we came here and we're like, this is where God wants us to be. You can go on to the next slide, please. It's making me scared even just looking at that. So I'm learning that weakness and that fragility is okay, and it's actually something that we can celebrate together, that we don't have to hide it. So I thought it'd be good to have a definition of weakness before we got too much further. Weakness is a lack of strength, power, or energy, and weakness can manifest itself in different areas. It can be physical, where your body is just not quite working. Maybe you've got bones or muscles that are weak, or some type of illness. It can be emotional, where you're just beat up, where you're carrying around some pain and some hurt. It can be social, where you're just one of these people who finds it difficult to meet new people and to interact socially. It's awkward and it's tough for you. It can be spiritual, where you have weakness, where you have questions about God, where maybe you're struggling a little bit in your faith, or you're just feeling dry spiritually. And there's probably something else that I'm missing here too, a way that, weakness can manifest itself in your life. But the important thing is that our society and our culture does not value weakness at all. You may have seen shirts or bumper stickers, or there's this slogan that says, pain is weakness leaving the body. And people who are very physically fit will sometimes wear these t-shirts, with their arms kind of bulging out of them. And From a business standpoint, there's even this school of thought that, you focus on your core competency. You do what you do really well. You focus on your strengths. And your weaknesses, you outsource, or you just cut off and you don't do business in those areas. So you focus on your strengths. So our society is not a big fan of weakness. But this morning I'm going to suggest that as people of God, that this is a way that we can take something that our culture has discarded and stand out and be different to reclaim it for God. So we're going to look at the book of Judges this morning. If you want to grab a Bible, there's Bible sitting around. If you're new here, or if you've been here forever, you just don't have a Bible, or you know someone who could use a Bible, you can feel free to take one of those home and make it yours. But we're going to be on page 169, if you want to turn there. Judges sounds like an incredibly terrible book. Okay, it sounds like a book that you read through it and it's all about God judging people. Or you read through it and it's about boring people wearing robes who are making, verdicts as far as different cases. But that's not really what it's about. Judges records a time in Israel between the death of Joshua, who took over after Moses, between his death and when Saul, the first king of Israel, was anointed. And it just recounts how God's people continue to turn away from him and how God will raise up people to turn them back to God, to deliver them. So I'm going to read Judges 6, 1 through 6. You can read along with me. It says, "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys." They even took the donkeys, y'all. It's terrible. "They came up with their livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help." So let me set this up. Imagine just for a moment that a foreign army marches in, takes over our country, and you and your family go into hiding. All right, and you manage to find some damp cave that will offer some source of protection and cover from the elements. And for 7 years, you are huddling in this cave, and there is no Kroger, and there is no Publix, and there are no free food samples at Costco. It's all gone, okay? And so you're a hunter, you're a gatherer, and maybe you farm. Okay, that's how you get your food for you and your family. Do any of you garden? Do you plant a garden? Some of you do. I see some heads nodding. I garden just a bit, and I'm ridiculous when it comes to my garden because I baby my plants. Like I get them in the ground, and I'll come home, and sometimes before I even go inside the house, I'll walk over and I'll kneel down and I'll look at them and see if they've grown any to make sure that they're doing okay. I don't talk to them. I haven't gone that far just yet. But the whole thing is just fascinating to me, and so I really, really baby my plants. And for those of you who garden, just imagine that every time you plant a garden, right, and things start coming up out of the ground, and you're thinking about how great it's going to be to eat those huge tomatoes, and you're going to have all this stuff left over that you can. It doesn't always work out that way, but you're thinking in your mind, this is the way this is going to work. But every time you plant a garden for 7 years in a row, someone comes in and just wipes it out before you get to enjoy anything. After you've put all that hard work into planting it, it just doesn't work out. Someone comes in and tramples all over it. Now that would be frustrating, but it would be terrible if you were counting on that to feed your family. That would be really, really frustrating and painful. And so that's the position that God's people find themselves in. And so finally, they cry out to God, and we're like, you've got to do something, you've got to help us. And so we'll read in Judges 6, verses 11 through 12. Here's where God answers that cry, or where he begins to answer it. The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Have any of you ever threshed wheat? I've never done it either, so I had to look this up and figure out, what is this threshing wheat all about? And threshing is basically where you loosen the edible parts of grain from the inedible part. It's all kind of intermingled together in wheat. And so when you thresh it, you separate what you can use from what you can't use. And there's a video here that we'll roll that shows a good way to do this if you were alive in Gideon's time. This is pretty entertaining, right? Okay, so basically the idea is you have all of your wheat out. You've got a big open area. Hopefully you have some sort of livestock that you can use. Now this is not Gideon, and this was not actually filmed in the time of Gideon, so I do want to make that disclaimer. I'm sorry. I couldn't find any of that footage on YouTube. So anyway, that gives you an idea of what threshing is. Okay, that would be a good way to do it. There's some efficiency there. If you don't have modern machinery, you use livestock, you have a big open area. But remember, Gideon doesn't have this luxury. Okay, they're in hiding. He's living in a cave. And so this is not really an option for him. And this text says that he's in a wine press. Now I ask you how many of you threshed wheat. I'm not going to ask you how many of you make your own wine, although that would be kind of fascinating to know. So again, I had to look this up too. So there's a photo here of a wine press, and this will give you an idea of the scenario. Full disclaimer, I don't know that this is the exact wine press. Okay, this is just something I found here. But the idea is you've got this big area here at the top, and that is where you would put grapes. All right, and that area is for this technical act that's called grape stomping. All right, that's the way you do this thing. And then you cut out an area out of the stone here that's called a collection vat. And so all of the juice from the grapes would run down into, it would run off the rock, obviously it wouldn't soak in, and it would roll down into this hole or collection vat. And the idea here is that Gideon, you would think originally that maybe he's got all of his wheat up here in this area and he's threshing it there. That might make some sense, but remember, he's having to hide. So my hunch is that our man Gideon has lowered himself down into this hole in the ground, this collection vat. Now, if you're in a hole, that changes the way you would thresh wheat. Okay, so there's another video here that might show us how he would be threshing wheat in a hole, if you want to go ahead and roll that one. Now there's like 2 minutes of this video, and we can watch it all if you're really fascinated by this. It's pretty monotonous, okay? It's not exactly fun to watch, and my hunch is that it would be even less fun to do that. So he's doing something in a place that's not built for what he's having to do there. Some of you have kids. Have you ever changed a diaper inside of a vehicle? Have you ever had to do this? Okay. You can do it on like the base of the passenger seat. Okay, you can try this where there's always this fear that the child is going to roll off into the floorboard. You can attempt to do it on the floorboard where there's a little bit less room and there's a chance that your child may grab onto a seat and kind of twist away from you. And always at this point you're thinking, why did I choose leather for my interior? Or why did I choose cloth? This is terrible, this isn't gonna work. And some of you have probably done this, we've done this, where you actually open the trunk of your vehicle and you place the child on the floor there of the trunk of your vehicle, and you feel bad because you think that people are driving by assuming that you're gonna put your child in the trunk, shut the door. Also a bad place to do it. You've got jumper cables and all sorts of random things that usually live in your trunk. It's just not a good place to do it. And that gives you a little bit of the frustration that Gideon was probably experiencing as he is threshing his wheat in a hole that's cut into the ground. So he's probably not in a very good frame of mind. And as he's doing this, at that moment, that's where he gets this ridiculous greeting from an angel of the Lord. He walks up and has the audacity to call him a mighty warrior. And to Gideon, it must have seemed like he was getting a visit from the archangel of sarcasm, right? He's threshing away. Angel comes up, oh, mighty warrior. And so I just imagine that he's like waiting for the angel to kind of crack a smile, or, he's waiting for the punchline to come through. But we'll read Judges 6, 13 through 16. Here's Gideon's response. Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied. Some of you are reading the Message, and I think in the Message it states it. Say what? I think that's the way it translates. But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have, save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I'm the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. Now, if you were here last week, you heard Brian talk about the intersection of passion and purpose. And I think this is really, for Gideon, where his passion intersects with his purpose in life. Now, he's threshing wheat, and he's probably frustrated about this. And you can tell that this scenario, this whole situation with the Midianites and him having to live in a cave, it's eating at him a little bit, because when the angel comes and greets him, the first thing that he says has to do with the Midianites. Like, where's God? Why has all this happened to us? So you can tell that it's on his mind and it's on his heart. And so his passion meets God's purpose here. The angel lets Gideon in on how God is planning to use him to bring deliverance for God's people. So we're going to fast forward just a bit. Gideon challenges the angel just a bit and says, I'm not really sure. I may not be the guy here for this job. But he finally comes on board with the plan. And it's just in time because the Midianites are about to roll in again. They are on the verge of coming through and just wiping out everything. It says the Midianite army is 135,000 men. Pretty big army. And Gideon rallies the troops from his people, and he manages to gather 32,000 men. Now, to give you an idea of what this would be like, imagine the population of Spring Hill deciding that they're going to take on, we as a city are like, this is a good idea. We're going to take on the combined population of Brentwood, Franklin, and Columbia. All right, we're going to go to war against these cities. You don't have to be a military commander to realize this is not a great plan on the surface. All right, you're really outnumbered here. But then God says something really crazy to Gideon. We'll pick this up in Judges 7. That's on page 170. Verses 2 through 8, the Lord said to Gideon, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Midian took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. Now when I read this, I started thinking, if God is going to prove a point that it's my strength that's going to save you and not your strength, it would almost make sense that God would send home the brave and that he would keep the fearful troops and that he would use those. That kind of makes some sense to me. In a way, it might make more sense for this message. But I started thinking, there's maybe a few reasons why God did it this way. Maybe he knows that Gideon has some weakness, okay? And maybe he senses, listen, if I surround this guy with a bunch of men who are trembling, they're going to get together and they're going to talk him out of this mission. They're going to say, listen, this is a really bad plan. We're going to get wiped out. Let's reconsider. Or maybe God knows that the fearful far outnumber the brave, and this is just a really fast way for him to thin out that army. That could be. Or it could be that this is a way to remind Gideon, you are toast without me, and it's not going to work unless it's by my hand. I'm doing this, not you. And on that note, put yourself in Gideon's shoes here just for a second. Have you led anything, or have you coached anything? Maybe it's at work, maybe it's a volunteer group, maybe you're coaching a little league team, I don't know. But imagine that you're leading something and you get up, you have this Disney movie moment. You get up and you say, listen, anyone who's afraid, you can walk out right now. And you're expecting, as what usually happens in Disney movies, is that the whole team will rally together and there'll be this great moment where they're like, we're with you, coach. And they like pick you up and they carry you on their shoulders and everyone comes together and the music swells and it's this beautiful moment. But for Gideon, it does not work out that way. It would be a very bad Disney movie because he gets up and he makes this challenge and he's like, listen, if you're trembling with fear, you can go home right now. And 2/3 of his army, they're like, thank you. And they just get up and go. They get up and go. Now imagine that you're Gideon. How crushed would you be if that happens? Where would your self-confidence be at that moment if all these people, 2/3 of the people that you're leading, get up and are like, I'm out of here? And so maybe this is just a way for God to get Gideon to lean even more on him. Now, okay, fast forwarding a little bit more, God finally tells Gideon that it's time to take these 300 men into battle. Okay, and here's where the battle happens. We'll be in Judges 7:16 through 22. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon. Gideon and the 300 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. So in the end, God brings about this amazing victory, and he does what he says he's going to do. Okay, so that's the story of Gideon in a nutshell. And on the surface, it doesn't sound like a story of weakness. Like, okay, we've got a guy here who leads 300 men to victory over an army of 135,000. How does that relate to weakness? But we'll take a closer look, and I think there's 4 takeaways that we can pull out of this story. We'll have a little bit of a closer look at it now. The first takeaway is to remember who knows your real name, and don't be surprised if it sounds wrong at first. God has a track record of giving names to people that just seem totally crazy. The angel of the Lord comes to Gideon as he's threshing wheat in a hole in the ground, and he looks at him and says, oh, mighty warrior. And at first, Gideon looks like a really weak version of a mighty warrior. Abram has no children when God comes to him and says, Father of nations. He seems like a really weak father at that point. Jesus is the King of Kings, and God sends Jesus to be born in a filthy stable. He seems like a really weak version of a King of Kings. And Jesus calls Simon by the name of Peter, which means rock. And he says, on this rock, I'm going to build my church. And then he proceeds to tell Peter shortly thereafter, you're going to betray me. You're going to do it 3 times. And sure enough, it happens. So Peter seems like a really weak version of a rock. I don't know if you've ever had the privilege and the responsibility of naming a child. We've done this twice, and you kind of agonize over these little details. And we named our daughter Savannah, and we, had this discussion of do we have the H on the end, or do we just leave it with the A? Because this is really this could impact the trajectory of her life. Like, this could really change everything. And then, well, we're gonna call her Anna. And then you're thinking, well, how will that change, her friends in school and how they relate to her? And you get into these, ridiculous conversations of, oh, if we name our son Tugboat, will he grow up and be a mighty sailor, with a big beard? You have these conversations about maybe, just maybe, the name that I give my child, maybe it's going to grow up and shape his or her personality or course of life. There'll be a verse on the screen. You don't have to turn to it. We'll just read it from here. This is in Revelation. It says, whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will also give that person a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to the one who receives it. I don't know exactly what this verse means, but I do know that God is really into naming things. But the difference is he's not naming us based on a hope or a dream of who we might one day become or what we may grow up to be like. He's naming us based on what he's going to do through us. How cool would it be if God looked at the good deeds that he's prepared in advance for us to do, and he looks at the mission in life that he has for us, and he gives us our name based on that. He has knowledge of who we are. He knows us better than we know ourselves. So we shouldn't be terribly surprised if the name that he gives us sounds wrong at first. And maybe God's calling you by a name that sounds really laughable to yourself, to the people around you, at first anyway. So remember who knows your real name. Don't be surprised if it sounds wrong at first. The second point is to go in the strength that you have. I'll reread Judges 6:14. It says, the Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Go in the strength you have. Those 6 words say a lot, but there's a lot that they don't say either. The angel doesn't use this time to tell Gideon why he's not qualified or why he's a really bad candidate for this particular role. He doesn't say, Gideon, drop what you're doing right now, stop the threshing, crawl out of the hole, and go march by yourself against the Midianites. He doesn't do that. He also doesn't say, Gideon, mighty warrior, now what I need you to do is go to several years of military school, get the proper training, come back, and then and only then God can use you. He says, go in the strength you have. These are marching orders just for Gideon right now to start on the path that God is calling him to. Warts, weaknesses, all of it. This is his call to go. And I love Gideon's response to go in the strength you have. This is verse 15. Pardon me, my Lord, Gideon replied, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. So the Lord says, go in the strength you have. And Gideon says, pardon me, I don't have any strength. And he's right. He's basically saying, my family, my heritage, my training, this is not a good fit for me. I can't do this. And does this resonate with you? I think we have a tendency to do the same thing, where God calls us to do something that's maybe a little bit ridiculous. And we try to convince ourselves and we try to convince God that this really can't be what he has in mind. And when God calls you to do something, immediately your weakness becomes obvious. Sometimes the first thing that comes to mind is why this is a bad idea and why this won't work. But we'll look at verse 16. This is the key here. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. The Lord says, go in the strength you have. Gideon says, what strength? And the Lord's response is, I will be with you. So there is the strength. I put the S in strength as a capital letter up here because we have to remember that the strength that we have isn't our own strength. The strength that we have is the fact that the Lord is with us. On a side note, a while back, Andy shared a story about how he took some kind of a church planter's aptitude test. This is one of those things where I guess if you're a pastor, you're hoping to be a pastor, you want to start a church, they call you a church planter. And they have different assessments that you can take that would tell you maybe how likely it is that you're going to succeed at this. And the fact is, he took this test and the results were not very encouraging, okay? He didn't test well that day. We'll just say it that way. But imagine, what if Andy would have heard God say church planter, but he takes this test and it says, not a church planter. What if he believes the test instead of God? Where are we right now? What are we doing this morning? So point number 2, go in the strength you have and remember who that strength is. Point number 3 is remember that God works through your weakness. I'm so thankful that Gideon's story is in the Bible. I'm weak and I doubt, and there's always a part of me that's unsure if I'm really on the path that God wants me to be on. And maybe you do the same thing. I hear people occasionally say things like, I couldn't greet people on a Sunday morning here at WellSpring, or I couldn't lead that class, or I couldn't get up and speak to a group of teenagers, or I couldn't get up on stage, or I couldn't go on a mission trip. And there's all these things that I couldn't do because it would scare me too much. I would be terrified. But I think those who do those things, I think there's a part of them that gets butterflies. And sometimes they get scared. Sometimes they feel weak. They may just have decided, I'm going to go for this thing. And if I fall on my face, that may be. But maybe, just maybe, God is behind this and he wants me to go do this. Now, Gideon had some weakness of his own. We'll backtrack and dig into a few parts of Gideon's story that we skipped over the first time. And this is Judges 6:17 through 18. Now, this takes place after the Lord has told Gideon that he's the vessel that he's going to use to wipe out the Midianites. It says, Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. So this is Gideon saying, are you really God, or are you just the neighbor down the road who's bullied me all my life, dressed up in an angel costume, giving me this suicide mission? And so he says, can I test you? And the angel basically says, bring this offering. And Gideon does. And the angel touches it, and it goes up in flames. And so the light goes on for Gideon. Yes, okay, this is God speaking to me. And he believes. Now look at this. In verses 25 to 26, that same night, the Lord said to him, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old, tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on the top of this height. Using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down, offer the second bull as a burnt offering. So Gideon believes, and then he gets his first assignment. Sounds simple enough, right? Tear down the altar, cut down the Asherah pole. And then read verse 27. So Gideon took 10 of his servants and did as the Lord told him. But because he was afraid of his family and the townspeople, he did it at night rather than the daytime. So not even a day after, Gideon has been convinced that God himself is calling him to wipe out an army of 135,000 people. We see Gideon weak and fearful that if I do this, the neighbors may get really angry at me. Okay, so he does it in the middle of the night. So he's already struggling a little bit with some weakness. All right, well, fast forward a little bit now to when Gideon has already assembled this army of 32,000 people, and they're gearing up to do battle. This is Judges 6, 36 through 40. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand as you said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Just a side note here, if you're ever out in the morning and there's dew on the ground, I've never, I think, experienced a situation where I could pick up something and wring out an entire bowl full of water. It's almost like God is making sure that he doesn't miss this. All right, he's like, I'm going to soak this thing with dew just so that he'll know. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew. So Gideon has amassed an army at this point, 32,000 men. And there's this moment of weakness where it sounds like he's considering getting the troops all together, and he's going to make this grand proclamation that, listen, there's been a huge mistake here, and I really just need all 32,000 of you to go back home because we're not going to do this thing after all. The plans have changed. So he comes back to God twice to ask for confirmation about this mission, and God does so. Now, I'm not suggesting that when God calls you to do something that you should ask for 2 signs before you'll move. I don't think that's the takeaway. But it does illustrate God's patience in the face of our weakness. Those moments where we maybe have just a little bit of doubt. And this next story, I think, does even more so. This is in Judges 7, verses 8 through 15. Now, this is after God has reduced his army to 300 men. And it's go time, and it's almost time to go into battle. It says, "Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, 'Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp.' So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. 'I had a dream,' he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." This is kind of a funny dream when you think about it, that he's dreaming of, big wheels of bread rolling down a hill. But anyway, his friend responds, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." When God heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Now, God is so good to Gideon here. He knew his weakness. So even before he asked this time, God arranges someone in the enemy camp to have this nightmare. And he gives Gideon the chance to go eavesdrop on the interpretation of this dream. It's like he's saying, "Gideon, I know what you're going to ask, all right? You keep asking me this. And yes, this is still the plan." Now, when we talk about weakness, sometimes it's tempting to think, well, this story's in the Old Testament, and this is before a time where followers of God have the Spirit of God dwelling inside of them. And, as believers now, shouldn't the Spirit drive out, all fear, all weakness, and all doubt? Well, I don't know. On the screen, you don't have to turn there, but we'll look at 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. Now, this is Paul, and he's an apostle and one of the great leaders of the church. It says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me.' That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, this is extraordinary. In different places in the New Testament, Paul writes about, I'm writing with my own hand, or look at these big letters that I'm using to write to you. So some people think that maybe Paul is struggling with some kind of a vision problem. I don't know. I don't know exactly what this weakness or this thorn is, but he's weak and he's struggling in some way. And the revelation here is that God reveals to him that his power isn't diminished or decreased or stopped by weakness, but his power is made perfect in weakness. That there's something about our weakness that allows God's power to flow through it. So Paul chooses to boast about his weaknesses instead of hiding them. And if that's true, and it is, that's really good news for us, that we don't have to hide our weaknesses and pretend they don't exist, or kill ourselves trying to make up for it, to turn them into strengths. Now, I'm not saying that we should live in a state where weakness immobilizes us, okay, and where we have so much doubt about who God is that we just don't do anything. I don't think that's what God intends for our lives to be like, but we have to remember that God works through our weaknesses. The fourth and final point to pull out of this story is don't forget who gets the glory. And we'll read in Judges 8. Okay, this is page 171. This is after the victory. This is Judges 8, 22 through 27. The Israelites said to Gideon, "Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And he said, "I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, "We'll be glad to give them." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, which is about 43 pounds. It's a lot of earrings. Not counting the ornaments, the pendants, the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. I remember God's reason for thinning out the army to just 300 men in the first place. He says, if I don't do this, you're going to forget. You're going to think it's your own strength and not my strength. But still, even with 300 men taking down the army of 135,000, the people here are saying, "Gideon, you're the one who saved us. You're the one who delivered us." So the people did forget. Now, I can't speak to Gideon's heart as to why he melted the gold down and made this ephod, which is like a priestly garment. You know, it's possible that he meant for that to be a reminder of sorts, that people could look at and remember God's deliverance. I'm not sure, but it sounds almost the way that this reads, that Gideon and his family share some blame for what happens, for the worship of this ephod. It doesn't say Gideon did the right thing, but the Israelites prostituted themselves and worshiped this ephod. Instead, it says Israel prostituted themselves and worshiped it, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So I don't know. It's possible that God thought Gideon should have done a little bit more to stop this idol worship once it happens. Maybe he should have done more to keep the focus on God instead of having the focus turn to Gideon and this idol worship. I'll put 2 Corinthians 4, 6 through 7 on the screen. You don't need to turn there. But again, this is Paul, thorn in the flesh Paul, who begged for God to take this weakness away. This is him writing. And I think this really paints the don't forget who gets the glory reminder in kind of a different light. It says, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." Friends, accepting God's salvation and following him doesn't turn us into superheroes who have perfect strength. It says here that God puts his treasure in jars of clay. This is common Tupperware in their time, okay? He puts his treasure in Tupperware so that the treasure gets the attention, not the container. So men, are you okay being a jar of clay? Or do you want to be a strong steel safe, okay, with huge biceps and six-pack abs and a full head of bushy hair? Are you okay with being a jar of clay? And women, are you okay with being a jar of clay? Or do you really, in your heart, want to be a beautiful vase who always looks the way that she did in college, with toned arms, and who does wonderful crafty things that makes Pinterest just, come alive? Are you okay with being a jar of clay? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with, good jobs and fit bodies and Pinterest and anything like that. But I think that we have to remember here who gets the glory. It's not us. We're just the vessel. So don't forget who gets the glory. So to wrap up, remember who knows your real name. Don't be surprised if it sounds ridiculous at first. Go in the strength you have. And remember who that strength is. And remember that God works through your weakness. His power is perfected in your weakness. And finally, don't forget who gets the glory. WellSpring, other churches in Spring Hill are going to have nicer buildings and more attractive people on stage who have hair or deep voices or whatever. And it's okay. I'm just here to say it's okay when that happens. In fact, there's, I think, a part of me that prefers it the way that it is, okay, that we can stay a little bit humble, that we can stay a little fragile, that we can stay just a little bit weak, because it reminds us that it's God who is our strength, and that it's God whose power is going to work through our weakness to impact the city.